Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm your host, Lois Lindstrom. Stay tuned for a scintillating book discussion about General George Armstrong Custer and his amazing military career during the Civil War and his tragic end at Little Bighorn, which is an iconic moment in American history. For modern propagandists, Custer's death fighting the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne was payment for American sins against the Indians. But was Custer really the bad man his modern enemies made him out to be? And how could the skilled cavalry leader suffer such a devastating defeat? In The Real Custer, author James Robbins studies the life of this fascinating man, drawing on correspondence, histories, and other personal documents to reveal the actual George Custer. So glad to have you here, Jim.
Oh, thanks, Lois.
It's a
Thanks for having me back.
Great book. And your book demonstrates that Custer, having graduated last in his class at West Point, was, to quote President Ronald Reagan, a brilliant officer and not at all boastful show-off his detractors have us to believe. He wasn't on a glory ride that fateful day. He was carrying out his orders to the letter. So, Jim, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, the short answer is that Regnery asked me to write it.
Okay.
The publisher wanted me to. But I had previously written a book called Last in Their Class, which looked at the goats of West Point, the people who graduated at the bottom, and of course, Custer is the most famous of the goats of West Point. So I had previously written that book, and then Regnery asked if I would like to do a biography just of Custer,
Okay.
and so of course I did.
So a goat means someone who is last, right?
Right, the person who's at the bottom.
At the very bottom,
Yes.
okay. And also, I wanted to take a moment to tell our viewers a little bit about your background. You have a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and you're a senior fellow for national security affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council, plus you're a commentary writer for USA Today, and you have authored several books, including Erasing America, Losing Our Future by Destroying Our Past. So I would like to start off with briefly, you're describing Custer's early life. What was he like in the beginning? I mean, where was he born, and how did he get his start with in getting appointed to West Point?
Custer was from Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
He also was educated as a boy in Michigan, so Michigan has a good claim on Custer as well.
He went to a boys' school there, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
he did. He lived with his half-sister in Monroe, Michigan, and went to school there. And his father was a farmer and a blacksmith. A kind of a middle-class upbringing.
So he wasn't really wealthy. I mean, he didn't come from. So wasn't, and also he wasn't politically connected then, was he? I mean, his father was not big in political circles, right?
Well, his father was on the wrong side locally. It was kind of a Republican area or a Whig area before that, and his father was a very outspoken Democrat who didn't mind telling people what his views were, and George took on that same persona of being sort of a outspoken Democrat in a Republican area. So politically, this didn't go well for him getting appointed to West Point.
Well, how did he do that then? How did he charm his way into that? I mean, did he write letters? How did he get that appointment?
Well, his congressman was John Bingham, who was a Republican, in fact, one of the first Republicans, later author of the 14th Amendment, so an important figure. And but George, he charmed him. He wrote him a nice letter, tried to get to know him and convince him. There's also a story that George, who at the time was teaching and rooming with a man named Mr. Holland, had started a romance with the daughter of the family, Mary, and the father, who was connected to Bingham, did not approve of this romance and thought, if we can just send this guy to West Point,
we'll get him
then
out of
that'll
the way.
solve the problem.
Like,
so
there you go. There you go.
That story.
Fate is amazing, isn't it? Well, many of us have read that Custer graduated last in his class at West Point. Can you give us some examples of Custer getting into various mischief at West Point? I mean, you wrote that he had the most demerits of any cadet.
Well, it is said that he had the most. He didn't. He did. This is the sort of tradition. He didn't actually, because by the time Custer came along, they had put a limit on the number of demerits you could get. Because they had some people in the early part of West Point who just racked up hundreds and hundreds of demerits. So by the time Custer came along, they said if you get 200 demerits, you're out. So Custer had to be very careful about running it right up to the limit.
Oh, I see.
And the thing about Custer at West Point is there are really two kinds of people you get at the bottom of the class. One type of person is they work really hard, they're kind of in over their head, they're doing their best, and they just kind of squeak through. The other kind of people you get at the bottom are people like George Custer. They get to West Point and they say, I can do this. You know, I can handle this. So I'm not going to study very hard. It doesn't matter if I'm, number one.
Yes.
I don't care about that. I'm just going to have a good time.
Okay.
And so these are people who were smart enough to be there and get away with it. Okay. Basically, they could get in trouble, but then they could get out of trouble. And George Custer was one of these guys.
And then you also wrote in your book that Custer was a devoted husband whose natural flirtatiousness opened him up to rumors of infidelity, but he had a very strong marriage to his wife, Elizabeth, who he called Libby, right?
Oh, right. Libby, whom he met in Monroe when they were children. It was like a lifelong romance. And people say it's kind of become a standard thing, like Custer was a ladies' man, that he was having all of these affairs and things like that. But there's not a lot of solid proof of this.
Okay.
I mean, the people who didn't like him, they just sort of took it for granted. Oh, he
must be cheating on her, right?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it's possible that he did. But when you really look into it and try to find the evidence, it's a lot of rumors and scuttlebutt. I mean, the fact remains they had a very solid relationship. He would even write letters to her, and as a husband, I find this really amazing. Like he would say, "Oh, I was walking down the street the other day, and I met this lovely blonde lady in New York, and we just started talking. We spent the day together, and Libby must have been just
beside herself,
fuming.
That's right.
But it tells me that actually that's a strong relationship if he can write to her something like that.
And they wrote romantic letters back and forth. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Well. What about, let's describe, Custer was a very handsome man. I mean, can you describe his looks and his personality?
Oh, well, maybe you're a better judge of, the handsome man aspect. But he was a very outgoing guy, fun-loving guy.
What was he, about 5'10", 5 foot?
Yeah. Very physically fit guy. I mean, for all the campaigning and stuff.
And he had these lovely locks, right? He had beautiful hair.
Right, because he took a pledge that he wasn't going to cut his hair during the Civil War until they defeated the Confederacy. And
really?
So that's why he grew his hair out. Of course, when he died at Little Bighorn, by then he had cut his hair.
But it was much shorter, yes.
But he is remembered as, Custer of the Golden Locks.
Yes. Well, there have been a number of films about Custer. What are some of your favorite ones and why? And which actor do you think best captured George Custer's boyish charms?
Yeah, different representations from different eras. I think many people are familiar with the Little Big Man portrayal of Custer as this kind of boasting idiot who led his men to death. Yeah. More recently, with the Night in the Museum, Bill Hader, Custer is kind of the good-meaning fool, but at least he's a good guy. In Little Big Man, he was a bad guy.
Yes.
In Night at the Museum, he's an idiot, but he's a good guy idiot.
But aren't there some films in the 30s that portray him more accurately, you think? I mean,
right.
Didn't Errol Flynn?
Yes, Errol Flynn, probably the classic, They Died with Their Boots On.
Yes.
The real classic one where he tried to portray the Custer of legend, the
heroic character.
The heroic character, the boyish character, the prankster. He had all of those elements of Custer. And of course, Ronald Reagan portrayed Custer in Santa Fe Trail.
That's right. Now, George Custer, you wrote, lives strongest in the American memory as an Indian fighter. Did he intensely dislike American Indians, you think?
Oh, not at all. That's an important myth about Custer that needs to be dispelled, that he had this hatred of the Indian. In fact, he had a great admiration for the Indian, and he wrote in one of his books that if he wasn't who he was, if he had been born as an Indian, he had sympathy with people like Sitting Bull and the Sioux who did not want to be on the reservation. the people who wanted to be free and to live the traditional life. He thought that those were really representative of a certain type of spirit that spoke to him. He got along very well with his Indian guides. They said he had the soul of an Indian.
Oh.
And it's wrong to think that he was somehow biased against them. He fought them because that was his job.
Yes.
When he was
he
assigned
was
to
given
do
those
that.
orders. That's right.
Yeah, but he also lived with them. Lived amongst them. The Crow and the other tribes who were friendly, and he admired them very much, and he learned from them, how to hunt and how to live on the frontier.
Well, and your book covers that. I think that's really great. Can you briefly describe what happened at Little Bighorn, the battle he lost to the Indians? That's the big show, isn't it?
Yes, probably one of the most written about battles in American history.
Absolutely.
Hard to sum up, really, in one word. When you look at the mistakes that he made going into that battle, and it was really atypical of him because he was brilliant tactically. His Civil War record was amazing.
Yes.
Even his record on the frontier was very good. But at Little Bighorn, a lot of things went wrong for him. He was in a hurry. He didn't have adequate intelligence. He divided his forces. He misestimated the enemy, which, number one, he didn't think there were so many, and number two, he didn't think they were going to fight.
Yes.
In frontier war, the big problem was locating and sort of pinning down the Indians because they were like guerrilla forces. They would move. And if you came across a big encampment and they knew you were coming, they would leave. And he thought that's what was going to happen, but it didn't.
Well, we're going to cover that battle again in this interview. Why do you think Custer is commonly misremembered in American history books?
Well, he was a controversial figure from the beginning. I mean, from his day. It's not something that happened later. People either loved him or they hated him even then.
And he was really well covered by the press, wasn't he?
Oh, extremely well covered.
I mean, they were writing articles about him all the time.
Oh yeah, he was. I mean, he cultivated that. I mean, he was a flamboyant figure. He just naturally attracted attention, no matter what he did. And once he understood that, he would take reporters with him on campaigns. He would ghostwrite his own copy. I mean, that's if you want to promote yourself,
that's right. Make sure you're writing the copy. That's
be your
right.
own ghostwriter. So he developed friendships and fame from that, but he also made enemies from that, as you might guess. There were officers who were not flamboyant, who thought it was unseemly of him to kind of be this garish figure.
And they were jealous of him too, I'm sure. Jealous of the coverage, probably.
Definitely, there's a lot of jealousy.
Yeah. So let's review Custer's early life. I mean, how did Cadet Custer react to the political divide among the cadets at West Point? Because 86 of the 278 cadets at the Academy in 1860 were from states that eventually joined the Confederates.
Right.
I mean, that's a lot of classmates. I mean, a lot of cadets that left.
Yes. Well, it was very interesting to look at West Point in that period, like right as the war was breaking out, because you did have these friendships that had developed, and that was one of the few places in America at that time where you had people from all over the country in one place.
Yes, in New York. It was in New York.
Yes, in New York. And Custer, for whatever reason, he had a lot of friends who were from the southern states. And partly because he was a Democrat and they were all Democrats. And the pro-Lincoln people were mainly Northerners.
Yes.
And so he had a lot of these friends. And, of course, they went away to go fight on the other side. But then, as I point out in the book, he keeps running into them during the war.
Yes.
He'll there'll be a prisoner, like, oh, here's my buddy, Gimlet Lee. And, in fact, stood as best man in a wedding.
That's right.
With one of the captured Confederates in Williamsburg.
I mean,
so you had a Union guy standing as best man in a Confederate wedding.
That's right. You can see why there were so many films made about him. His life is like a film.
It's amazing.
Now, you write that Cadet Custer had to, during the last 2 months at West Point, he had to cram a year of study into 2 months because they were positioned to graduate early because the war had started, right?
Right.
And so he's sent off to a battle like 4 days after he leaves West Point.
Yes, because they had a 5-year curriculum, but when the war broke out, they took the seniors graduated, and then they had the next year, which was Custer's year.
Yeah.
And they gave him a crash course and then graduated them as fast as possible. And he hurried on down and was able to get into the Battle of Bull Run, Manassas,
Yes.
in Virginia, the first big battle of the Civil War.
And what was his reaction to Bull Run? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that he, like a lot of people, were surprised that the Union didn't just
Wipe out the South.
wipe
right?
out the South, like one battle and it's done. I think a lot of people at the time thought this is going to be a short war. You had like 3-month enlistments,
Sure.
9-month
Yes,
enlistments.
yes.
Everybody thought it was going to be a short war, except Custer. He wrote a letter before he went down to be in the war saying, I don't think it's going to be short. I think this is going to go on a long time. And in part, I think it's because he knew these guys, these Southerners who were his friends at West Point, and he knew that they were very determined to fight this thing out.
This is what I discovered reading your book, that the passion on both sides was so high, it was so strong. You could see how they were just fighting each other to the death. I mean, it was just, both sides were so passionate.
Oh, yeah. And he had these discussions with his buddies, like, what do you think's going to happen? They're like, we're going to resist you to the end. And so he internalized that. He knew they weren't kidding.
Yeah.
And he fought them that way, too.
Yes, and so Custer had a number of lucky breaks in his military service, starting with General Pleasanton being tapped to take over the command of the Union Cavalry Corps. Can you tell us more about that? He was a cavalryman, right?
Right. And Custer was fortunate in that, well, he figured out, I think, too, that if he attached himself to the staff of these generals, that he could then get into situations where he could fight, because he really wanted to get into battles.
Yes.
And whenever there was a battle, he would try to get into it.
Yes.
And so with General Pleasanton, he was able to kind of show his ability tactically to get in the fight.
And he's very aggressive, and he goes right to the front, doesn't he?
Right, and which is something that Lincoln wanted and was trying to encourage people, not these guys who would hang back, like the stereotype of General McClellan, who just was good at some things but not a fighter.
That's right.
And Lincoln wanted fighters. Well, Custer was one of those fighters, and so when General Pleasanton was putting together the Cavalry Corps and selecting people to be his senior officers, Custer was one of them.
Yes, and then at the Battle of Gettysburg, I was so dramatic because Custer's horse was shot from he was shot from underneath him. In other words, his horse was shot and he just fell off the horse. And then the Confederate had the rifle just to kill him. But then tell us what happened next.
Right. Well, yes. Shortly before Gettysburg Custer, he led a charge against a Confederate force. He was shot from his horse, and then one of his privates came up and like in a movie, just came out, scooped him up, and they
scooped him up on his horse. Right?
Yeah, because he was about to be either captured or killed, and this private just ran in and grabbed him. And this is not like the only time this happened. It happened a lot to Custer because he always led from the front. I mean, whatever critics can say about Custer, you can't accuse him of being a coward.
No, absolutely not.
Because he was always in front.
He was very brave.
He would lead charges that he wasn't even involved in.
Yes, he was a man of action. And at the age of 23, he was given the rank of Brigadier General. I mean, that has got to be the youngest age to be named a Brigadier General in the United States, don't you think?
At the time it was, yeah. There have been some other examples, but yeah. And this was also going on the Confederate side because for these new cavalry units, and it's it was an experimental thing that they were doing, they needed young guys who weren't beholden to old ways, who could, new dogs with new tricks.
Yes.
and young guys who weren't afraid. And so, particularly on the Union side, where they were kind of catching up to what Jeb Stuart had been doing on the Confederate side. And so Custer, and there were some other guys in their 20s that they had promoted to these high ranks, not as young as Custer. And they were the spearhead of this new use of cavalry that was premiered really at Gettysburg.
Well, in fact, you wrote in your book that Custer didn't believe he had been promoted to brigadier general. He was shocked. He didn't believe it. He thought it was a mistake.
At first, he thought it was a joke, like someone was playing a joke on him.
Yeah, that's right.
But
it was true. And then his star really rose after Gettysburg, and the reporters really liked him. I mean, how did General Kilpatrick, who was planning a daring raid on Richmond, Virginia, treat Custer?
Yeah, this is one of those interesting Civil War rivalries because Kilpatrick was Custer's commander and didn't like him because Custer was
getting all the press, right?
Getting all the press. And so when there was this Richmond raid was being planned, George was off marrying Libby, so he was kind of out of Washington, and there was this, Washington, this insider stuff going on where they're talking about this raid, and Kilpatrick saw it as being like he was going to go down to Richmond, free a bunch of Union POWs, maybe even attack the Confederate government.
Yes.
And
in the war, right there.
Right, and just be this like famous guy. And it actually, in the end, it turned out well that Custer was
not there
because this thing was a
disaster.
Total failure.
Yes,
so, a big disaster.
The Union was defeated on that one.
And Kilpatrick was sidelined after that.
Yeah. So briefly describe in your chapter, it was called Custer's Counterinsurgency, in which Custer's cavalrymen defeat the Confederate cavalry under the leadership of John Singleton Mosby.
Right. Well, you see, the interesting thing about Mosby's raiders who operated in Northern Virginia, the Union Army didn't at first know how to deal with this because they were fighting like a guerrilla war. And Custer was one of the guys sent in to help deal with this.
Yeah.
And at first, General Sheridan said, we'll just go in and clean them out. It's like every counterinsurgency the United States Army fights, they have to relearn the lessons that you can't just go in and clean them out. If the insurgents have the people on their side, you're not just going to go in like, we'll send in 2 regiments then. Make it 5 regiments.
Right.
No, that's not going to work. And Custer was one of the guys sent in to do this. And he didn't have a lot of luck either in trying to stop Mosby from doing what he was doing. But it did teach Custer some things about counterinsurgency, which he later used, guerrilla warfare when fighting the Indians on the plains.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, and of course, Custer was the toast of Washington, D.C. during the Victory Parade celebrating the end of the war. Describe how the crowds cheered for Custer. I mean, they were just madly cheering his name, right? Yes,
probably one of the best moments of his life when the Union Army, a 2-day-long parade, parading down
Pennsylvania
Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. And at the head of it was the Cavalry Corps, and at the head of that was Custer, because Sheridan was away in Texas doing some things. And he lost control of his horse, quote unquote. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, because they were throwing flowers and someone put a big wreath on his horse. And it is said that he lost control of it. But what happened was he went charging down past the reviewing stand in front of the White House, his hair flying in the wind, and just being this amazing guy. They said it looked like a Sioux chieftain.
Yes.
And it really sounds to me more like he was just showing off.
Right. But great for picture taking, right?
Yes,
great.
An amazing event.
Amazing event. And then, of course, after the Civil War, you wrote that robbery, plundering, and murdering was a daily occurrence. But it was the way that Custer treated his men on a march to Texas that was inhumane, I thought. I was really shocked about this chapter on when he took it was post-war Custer, and he had all these basically half-starved troops. I mean, there was after the war, there's not much food, and people are really planning to go back to their farms and this, that, and the other. And there he is driving these men really ruthlessly, I think.
Yes, this was right after the parade. Mm-hmm. He went to Texas because Texas wasn't quite secure yet. Mm-hmm. There were also in Mexico, which was occupied by France, there were French troops on the border. There was some concern that we were going to get in a war with France, which is really interesting. And so Custer was one of the commanders of an expeditionary force to go into Texas. Mm-hmm. And there were various problems with this. Number one was logistical, like they didn't know where they were going. The maps were bad.
Yes,
they didn't have the supplies and things that they needed. Second thing was these were troops Custer had never commanded before, so they weren't used to him. He had his own ways of doing things.
Sure.
The third thing is that these were not Easterners, these were Westerners. Here, Western troops from Iowa, from Indiana, and other states. And there was a difference in culture between how Eastern troops did things, which is very by the book,
And
Western troops were kind of doing their own thing.
Yes.
And they weren't used to Custer's method of command.
He was kind of like a dictator, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, especially when they weren't really paying attention to him. He got more that way. And then the fourth problem was, really, the war was over, and these were volunteer regiments. These were not regular Army guys.
Right.
And they wanted to go home.
Right,
And the War Department was saying, no, you have to stay in to march into Texas and maybe fight France. And these guys from Iowa or Illinois, Indiana, they're like, we didn't sign up for this.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
signed up to beat the South. The South is beaten.
And we need to go home.
And we need to go home. And so there was this huge discipline problem, and it, wound up with Custer having some guys whipped, which really, his star plummeted after that.
I bet. And so let's, at the close here, let's talk about analyzing the Battle of Little Bighorn. I mean, you wrote, few battles have been as minutely analyzed as the Battle of Little Bighorn. Well, what was the difference in terms of numbers? How many Indian troops were there versus the troops under Custer?
Oh, Custer was vastly outnumbered, which, again, it might not make a difference if the Indians are fleeing, but they stood and they fought. So problem number one.
Wasn't it like 3,000 or 4,000 of them?
Right.
It was like a lot of Indians.
Yes, yeah, against 500 or so.
Yes.
Of which, and he had divided his force, so it compounds the problem because the Indians were engaging Custer and a small part of his regiment, not the whole regiment, which was back here, who were engaged later.
Now, do you think that Reno, was it Colonel or General Reno was supposed to come bring other troops in to supplement the ones that Custer had? I mean, did he fail in his not showing up on time? I mean, what happened there? Wasn't there supposed to be more people coming in to help him?
Yes. Well, Custer had divided his force, and Reno's troops were going to go this way to attack the village, and Custer was going down this way to cut them off, like if they were running, which of course they didn't. Then there was another column coming up, a much larger infantry column, but Custer had attacked too soon. So they were still way downstream and couldn't make it there in time to support. So, and then there was another part of Custer's force that he had sent off this way under the command of Benteen. So if even late in the battle, if they had been able to get everybody back in one place, they probably could have made it. But Custer's troops in particular were far too far.
They were far too
down the ridge.
That's right. They were by themselves. That's right.
There was no way to reunify
to protect
the
them.
command.
That's right. That's right. Well, Jim, I'm so sad our session has come to an end. I thank you so much for being a guest author on our program. And where can our viewers find your book to buy it?
Mostly on Amazon.
Okay. And the book was published in 2014, but it's been selling well ever since, hasn't it?
Yes.
And rightly so. It's a fantastic read and great history.
And it was optioned for a movie, so maybe you'll see it on the screen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
And thanks for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.